Hello and welcome to week 4 of the history of photography. Last week we talked about 19th century portraiture, and this week we will pick up into 20th century, the major names of 20th century portraiture. I also want you to notice a couple things. This would be a 19th century camera, part of my collection. And notice the lack of convenience here for taking portraits. You can only shoot one picture at a time. It opens up in the back. And this would be well, this is my current digital camera. This is a 20th century or 21st century camera. Faster, more convenient, a zoom lens, better for portrait photography. And I want you to make the note of that because I'm going to assign today paper 2, which is a compare and contrast of 19th and 20th century portraits. How they were done, but more importantly, the quality of the portrait. Remember, a portrait isn't just a shot of your head. It tells the story of who you are. It reveals something of the character of the person involved. Now, the names we're dealing with today are Irving Penn. Irving Penn started out as a freelance designer in New York City, and he got picked up to be an associate art director at Saks Fifth Avenue by a guy named Rittz, who would later be the person who hires um, Richard Avedon to work also for Vogue. Rittz wanted to bring Penn, and Penn actually worked there for a couple of years, and then he went off across Mexico and the United States to photograph and to paint. He came back and and then started working for Vogue. But World War II broke out, and he went off to drive ambulance for the English in India. He came back after the war and went to work for Vogue, which he would stay with for many years. At Vogue magazine, he initially was the art director and designing, and at one point, Rittz asked him to take a picture, and Penn discovered he liked doing that. So Penn continued, and then into the 1950s, he set up his own studio in New York City. Irving Penn's photography is very classically driven, very striking images. It's also continuous light or hot light, not flash so much initially. So they would strike these very dramatic poses. Um, he also did a lot of still lives and celebrity work. Next on the list is Yusef Karsh. Yusef Karsh is Armenian and prided himself on being Armenian. His family had to escape the Middle East because of the Armenian genocide in the early 1920s or whenever that happened. His family did a 1-month march across the desert to Aleppo, Syria, and from there his family put him on a boat to Nova Scotia, Canada, where his uncle took him, and his uncle taught him photography. His uncle was a local commercial photographer and taught him photography. And then later, Karsh traveled to Boston to assist and learn from another noteworthy Armenian, probably the most important Armenian photographer in the United States. Karsh only wanted to photograph celebrity. He returned to Canada, and there he had befriended the Prime Minister of Canada. And the Prime Minister of Canada would introduce him to celebrities and world leaders who were visiting Canada and let him photograph them. So early on, Karsh had this entree into world leaders to take their picture and build a very impressive portfolio. His photography style could best be described as very formal and almost like theatrical lighting, where you have that little sheen across the person's face that shows all the details. Generally, you don't want to show all the pores, but he would. And he could do real beauty lighting on women too. He'd photograph celebrities, world leaders, and he only wanted to photograph celebrities and world leaders because, as he put it, this is the small percentage of the world that makes the world go round, not the vast majority of people. He also apparently jokingly once said he wants to photograph celebrities as a way of creating his own immortality. He, at one point, Winston Churchill traveled to Canada to make a series of speeches with regards to the ongoing challenges of World War II. And Karsh had a chance to photograph him. And this is a famous photograph that you will recognize. We're going to show it in a bit. You will recognize this photograph. It's the one where Churchill is snarling at the camera a bit because apparently Karsh asked him to remove his cigar and Churchill said no. So he reached over and snatched it out of his mouth and fired the shutter. And he caught Churchill. Churchill has just had a cigar yanked out of his mouth. Was miffed to say the least. But it became the most famous photograph of Churchill. It is supposed to be the most reproduced photograph of any portrait ever. It's been on the £5 note of England. Next on the parade is Arnold Newman. Arnold Newman, Jewish, which is fine. Arnold Newman, but it plays out in one of his photographs, these are all deceased, these guys so far, except for the last two on your list. They're all deceased at this point. Arnold Newman was an environmental portrait photographer, meaning he would place elements or arrange elements around the person so you can tell the life they lead and the things that they do. We'll see examples of this stuff. One of his more famous photographs was of Igor Stravinsky at his piano, which is a huge, grand piano, and the thing was lifted up. It looks like a huge note, a gargantuan note, which speaks of the life of Igor Stravinsky, composer and pianist. If you don't know who Igor Stravinsky is, as a child, you may have seen Disney's Fantasia, and there's a man conducting, a silhouette of a man conducting. That's Stravinsky himself. Now, Arnold Newman did a photograph of, what's that coffee maker? Sorry for that little, I wanted to look up. I keep saying it was Alfred Krupp, the coffee maker. Alfred Krupp was also part of his business was part of the Nazi war machine. And that's why I mentioned early on that Arnold Newman was Jewish. So he had a little axe to grind. And was given a chance to photograph Alfred Krupp. And Krupp said, "You can make me look good, right?" And Newman said, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to take care of you." And he set up a really sinister shot with this cross lighting across Krupp's face and a view of a factory with people, slaving away on the floor. It was his little revenge on Alfred Krupp. So Arnold Newman photographed such celebrities as Marilyn Monroe, John Kennedy, Robert Oppenheimer. You'll recognize that name from the atomic bomb, from the Manhattan Project. Many famous artists. We'll see his stuff shortly. Herb Rittz was born in Los Angeles and was born in like 1950. Herb Rittz, his father ran a furniture manufacturing company. His mother was an interior designer. He went to Bard College on the East Coast, studied art history, came back. He was friends with Richard Gere, the actor, before Richard Gere was famous. And Richard Gere asked him to photograph him next to a car, like a Chrysler or a Plymouth or who knows what, something that looked cool. And so Herbert took the picture. Herbert thought, that was fun, I can do this. So Herbert stepped into celebrity photography. And he was extremely good. One of the things I want to say about Herb Ritz is that while many photographers have a style that they play out over and over and over, a formula which they just run to the end and never seem to tire of, Herb Ritz photography is always brand new. Every photograph he takes is a new handcrafted invention for the person being photographed. Richard Avedon, a New York photographer, was born in New Jersey, but he became a New York photographer. And what he brought to his photography, also fashion and celebrity and portraiture, what he brought to his photography was a sense of motion and action, not so static. His pictures weren't actually static. They had a sense of movement and excitement. He did a lot of celebrities. I'm going to move on to Annie Leibovitz. Annie Leibovitz, we'll see Avedon's picture shortly. Annie Leibovitz, in the 1960s, she was in San Francisco and she had studied photography. Someone taught her photography, like in college. And she went to, apparently walked in the door of Rolling Stone magazine and said, I want to be a photographer. And they're like, right. And she said, I can take a better picture. So they gave her a chance and she did really well. So she started traveling with rock and roll bands and doing their covers. And later, because it was 1967, the summer of love and lots of drugs, she got in trouble. She got herself addicted and she had to get herself into a program to get herself out of her addiction. She succeeded at it and never, ever went back to drugs in her life. She gets all the big assignments. Look at the cover of Vogue today. It's probably Annie Leibovitz. You just turn inside and see who took the picture. It's very often it's her. Very, very often it's her. She gets the big assignments. She, at one point, wanted to buy a studio in New York City, and she put up as collateral her library of photographs that she had taken, and then she defaulted on this $25 million loan for the building and lost the control of all her art. A disaster, a disaster. I don't know how that was resolved. There is a documentary on her that I would like all of you to see, and I'll give you the link for that later. Steve McCurry. Steve McCurry, in the mid 1970s, Russia invaded Afghanistan. He was a guy living in the Middle East, taking pictures, trying to, eke out a living as a freelance photographer. When you were little and you went to the dentist's office, there would be a little magazine called Highlight or High Life or something like that, kind of geared towards little kids. And he would take pictures that they kind of gave him some assignments here and there. Well, apparently one day, about three men in turbans walked up to him and said, we see you're an American. We see you're a photographer. Come with us and see what the Russians have done to our country. At this point, Afghanistan was a curtain had dropped on Afghanistan and it was a news silence. No one knew what was going on in there. They smuggled him in. And the funny thing about the Afghanis is you can actually be a blue-eyed person and mix into the crowd. There's no other Middle Eastern country where that's true. But you can actually look like another Afghani with blue eyes. So they smuggled him in, and they passed him off. They dressed him. He didn't say anything. They did all the talking, but they got him into various positions where he could see what the Russians were up to, and he photographed the nightmare of what the Russians were up to. They would make little toys. They would take little toys, put a bomb on the inside, and drop these for Afghani children to pick up and play with. And when the bomb went off, it would take off. It would blind them, take off their hands and their fingers. I mean, it was horrific. It was really bleak. He got the film to, I think, his brother, and his brother got the film developed and took the film to Newsweek and Time and said, I have a brother in Afghanistan. Do you want to look at these pictures? And they said, yeah. For those of you who've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, those photographs started all of that. It is rare for a person with a camera to change the history of the world, but we can safely say that about Steve McCurry. So this, by the way, is take 2 of this, and I'm going to again attempt to load up my PowerPoint. Share screen, and let's hope this works. Because it failed me last time. Cool, it worked. End meeting, leave meeting. No, I don't want either of those. How did this happen to me? Stop sharing. Oh, okay. So this is Irving. This is Truman Capote. Truman Capote was a playwright. If you've ever heard of the book In Cold Blood, he wrote it. And I want you to look at the lighting on his face. It's very dramatic. You know, look at the deep shadow on the right side of his face, and there's one light right in his eye, which causes his pupil to contract, and the way he's used his fingers to frame his face. The photographer is in charge of everything. The photographer's job is to be in control of everything. So it's safe to say that he was directed to put his hands there. I don't actually know who Joseph Brodsky is, but look at this face. You can see all of the whiskers in his face. You can't actually even see his eye. It's a very, very dramatic profile. This is George Balanchine. He was a choreographer in New York City. And these photographs are really all the way in there. So you see like every pore and every flaw in a person's face, in a man's face. Now, when we get to composition next week, we'll talk about this. We'll see this picture again then. And it's called chiaroscuro, when you have that play of light and dark, that deep, dramatic shadow on a person's face. And I don't know who actually wears a monocle. I had a chance to put one on once, and it was like so uncomfortable. I'm like, this is pointless. I'm getting rid of this thing. It wasn't made for me. I just found one in a junk shop. Hell's Angels are in his studio. He dropped a canvas so they could park their bikes on top. He doesn't actually have to see a studio. Isaac Bashevis Singer is a Polish author. I've read a lot of his books. They're wonderful. He writes about basically Poland just before World War II. Now, this is Agnès Nin. She's a French writer. Tom Wolfe. If you've ever seen The Right Stuff, he wrote that. Or Bonfire of the Vanities, he wrote that. Truman Capote again. This is Irving Penn. The one on the left is when he was traveling in Borneo photographing, no, it says New Guinea, my apologies. In Irving Penn, 1938, when he was a young man. Yusef Karsh. Ernest Hemingway. At this point, he was known as Papa Hemingway, late in life before he committed suicide. And Karsh especially uses that theater lighting that shows every detail. Humphrey Bogart, light skimming his face to pick up all the detail. That's a gorgeous shot. Audrey Hepburn was the beauty of her age, and her skin is absolutely impeccable, and the lighting is such that it's not a light skimming her face, but it's light going into her face, so it erases any blemishes. At some point, you should see the movie Wait Until Dark. Alan Arkin terrorizes her in Wait Until Dark, ruined his career for a while, they say, because she was America's sweetheart. Fidel Castro, look at the sheen on his nose. This is something, I wouldn't say it's a merciless light, but it's not a light that's hiding anything. General Charles de Gaulle of France, very formal. He managed he was in charge of France from the position of England during World War II, and later president of France. Albert Einstein, famous beyond measure. Look at the crinkles around his eyes. They're not hiding a single detail here. Elizabeth Taylor, again, an impeccable complexion, and the lighting is soft as can be. H.G. Wells, science fiction writer. Think of War of the Worlds. Ingrid Bergman. Again, an impeccable complexion, and it's a light sheen on her cheek and her forehead. Also, a light skimming part of her forehead on her right side. Still, she is absolutely beautiful. Jasper Johns is a fine artist. Judy Garland. King George VI. If you've seen the King's Speech, this is the stuttering king. Mother Teresa. So these are all of the famous. Pablo Picasso, Princess Grace of Monaco. I had the same birthday as her, although I'm not as old and I'm alive. But again, an impeccable collection or complexion. Rogers and Hammerstein. Think Sound of Music. Georgia O'Keeffe. We're going to see another photograph of her shortly under Arnold Newman. And I stood in exactly that spot once. Boris Karloff, Frankenstein. Harlan Sanders, Think Kentucky Fried Chicken. The Kennedys. I think this is a composite because I look at the light on John Kennedy's face, it's skimming. That would almost have to go through Ted Kennedy's head to get there. So I think this is a composite picture. Also, there's a depth of field challenge. They're all sharp and they're not exactly on the same plane. Jacqueline Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, First Lady. General Dwight Eisenhower. Five-star general, supreme military commander of the entire European theater in World War II. Martin Luther King Jr., great shot. Sir Edmund Hillary, the second man to stand on top of Mount Everest. The first one was Tenzing something, his Sherpa who went there with him, was the first man to stand on top of Mount Everest. Christian Dior, fashion. Winston Churchill. This is a man who's just had a cigar snatched out of his mouth, and he's not happy. If you ever see the picture taken just before it, he was like smiling a little bit. But this became the face that would save England from what march England or lead England through World War II and the Blitz. But it's really a man who just had a cigar yanked out of his face. He took 37,000 photographs. Arnold Newman. Now, this is Aaron Copland. Arnold Newman, again, is the photographer who does environmental portraiture. And while you can't really tell here, that's Aaron Copland's sheet music outlining his head. But it did not record well when I made this image. This is a composer. His name is lost on the screen, I'm sorry to say. George Rousseau. Kurt Gödel is a theoretician, mathematical theoretician. So he's got a blank slate that he's going to fill in with his thoughts. This is Ben Gurion, who was effectively the George Washington of Israel. John Kennedy, 1961, at the White House, obviously. Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia. He is the man that told the whole world World War II is coming and nobody listened. Marc Chagall, painter. Piet Mondrian. Now, I want to talk about this one in particular for a second. Look at this picture. This is a painter standing with his easel. The easel goes straight up and the base of the easel is horizontal. Why not? Now let's look at one of his paintings. This is one of his paintings. Given the organization of this painting, does this portrait make sense? This is I.M. Pei, architect. Believe it or not, this whole black screen and that one thin banner of window is a portrait of I.M. Pei, the architect. And here's one of his buildings. Sorry about the low resolution. It was a bad copy off the internet. But given the design of this building, does this picture make sense to you? It does to me. Georgia O'Keeffe against a white canvas with a ram skull or some sheep skull above her against a blue New Mexico sky. Now, does this picture make sense given this painting of hers? Given that, does this make sense to you? It does to me. Edward Hopper, 1960, painter. Robert Oppenheimer, 1948. He led the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb dropped on Japan. Evidently, he was just astoundingly brilliant. He was fluent in Sanskrit by the age of 21. He was just brilliant beyond measure. This is the picture I mentioned earlier of Igor Stravinsky. This assignment was given to Newman from the Saturday Evening Post, was it? And they didn't like the picture, even though the lid of the grand piano looks like a huge note. And Stravinsky is a composer and pianist, and that note makes sense. Pablo Picasso. Cecil Beaton was a photographer, incredibly flamboyant character. I think that speaks of a flamboyant character. Andy Warhol. He cut up this picture to make that. That's very cool. Carl Sandburg, poet. He was the poet laureate of the United States and read the poet at Kennedy's inaugural. He was a very old man then. Ansel Adams at the door to his darkroom, wearing his darkroom apron. This is Carmel, California. Now, this is the picture I mentioned earlier of Alfred Krupp, the Nazi, part of the Nazi war machine. And there's a view looking over the factory where people are just slaving away. And the lighting is done to make him look sinister, and the entire posture makes him look sinister. Newman wouldn't show him any of the Polaroids, so Krupp didn't know what was being done with his face. And this is Marilyn Monroe, whose life is a tragic story. And this, for all the beauty shots we've seen of other people, Jackie Kennedy, Judy Garland and such, this picture is less than flattering, but does, in my view, speak of how hard Marilyn Monroe's life was. Now, this is Paul Strand, photographer. We'll come to his name when we get to pictorialism and photo succession. But he was a master printer. Look at the edge of this photograph. It's like print paper. William de Kooning, fine art painter. And this is a self-portrait of Arnold Newman in a mirror. He passed away in 2006, I believe. Richard Avedon. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Richard Avedon was not afraid to have motion in his photographs. This is Twiggy. She was the it girl in the late 1960s. Now I think she's on one of those, she's one of those judges on a show for fashion or something. Natasha Kinski posed with this boa constrictor. And people asked her about it. Was she afraid? She goes, no. Marlene Dietrich in the middle of lighting a cigarette. Marlene Dietrich was invited by Hitler to come back to Germany, and she goes, no. She wouldn't have nothing to do with the Nazis. She instead went to great lengths to entertain Allied troops during the war. Bob Dylan, I think this is his first album cover in 1965. Oscar Levant, pianist. Now that's a portrait. This is a dance teacher. Killer Joe Pirro, what a name. Dance teacher. Salman Rushdie is an author, and he got in trouble with the entire Muslim world for writing a book called uh, The Satanic Verses. So there's a death sentence on him. He's been in hiding ever since. Tennessee Williams, think of the play The Glass Menagerie. Truman Capote, again, think of the book In Cold Blood. Truman Capote really changed the nature of journalism by telling the story rather than just reporting the facts. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the matriarch of all the Kennedy family. Katharine Graham of the Washington Post. Katharine Graham can be credited with effectively bringing down the Nixon presidency over Watergate. She inherited the Washington Post when her husband passed away, and she had to step in and suddenly be in charge of all these men who didn't think she had, the backbone, and she pulled it off. Katharine Hepburn, actress. Like I said, there's motion in his photographs. The Dalai Lama. Governor George Wallace and his valet. I'm going to tell a little bit of the story of George Wallace. George Wallace was an absolute racist. I think he used the expression segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he ran for the presidency in 1968, and it was an attempt on his life, and he was left in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And the black man on his left, our right, is his personal valet who takes care of him. 13-year-old snake skinner. And the entrails of the snake. Wow, dude. Drifter, Clarence Uppard. We're talking about people who just hitchhike around the West. Another drifter. Hickok murderer. And that's Richard Avedon himself in a state of motion on his own. Herb Rittz. Let's go through Herb Rittz. Herb Rittz, this is Naomi seated. Herb Rittz handcrafts his photographs every time. This is Jackie Joyner Kersey, who was an Olympic runner. And this is a portrait. It's really her legs, but that's her story. Christopher Reeve, confined to a wheelchair after his horse accident. Now, let's say something about this. In the 1930s, FDR had leg braces and a wheelchair, and it was just accepted that we're not going to photograph and show his leg braces, his crutches, or his wheelchair. And here we are photographing and showing everything. So the days of, discretion are basically over. Sorry about that line in the center. This is it where the book opened and I didn't handle it well. So that's called the gutter jump. And I can't remember his name, but he's an actor. Who is this? This is Demi Moore. Demi Moore in G.I. Jane, sorry. This is Glenn Close. This is Michelle Pfeiffer. This is Madonna before she went blonde on us. Jack Nicholson has been described as the man with the killer smile. Dizzy Gillespie plays trumpet. Charles Bukowski was a writer. Elizabeth Taylor, and I think you can see that there's a scar in her head. So she's cut her hair very short. She's not dyeing her hair black anymore at this point. And you can see a scar with apparently something happened, some sort of surgery. And yet this is a very elegant photograph, a very softly lit and gracious photograph of Elizabeth Taylor. Also Elizabeth Taylor in her youth. John Travolta. And again, this is what I'm talking about, that the pictures are handcrafted. Each time he's wearing a pilot's cap. This is called a vignette when it all bleeds off white all the way around. John Huston, film director, actor. His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Annie Leibovitz. Baryshnikov. They basically took a platform out into the woods, took out century stands, dropped a backdrop and a piano and set it up out there. That's money and that's ambition. Bette Midler was in a movie called The Rose. And apparently they had set up the shot, they wouldn't have roses, and dozens of roses were delivered. They all had thorns on them. And Liebovitz hadn't occurred to her that these were going to come with thorns. So she and her assistant were pulling thorns off because they didn't want Bette Midler to get, pricked by a thorn. Willie Shoemaker, jockey, and Wilt Chamberlain, both supreme athletes. Christo, of course, you recognize him, installation artist. Demi Moore, this is the photograph that was on the cover of, I think, Vogue or Vanity Fair. I can't remember which, sorry. Clint Eastwood on set. Kirsten Dunst. I think this is at the, it's in France. Lauren Hutton, actress. This is the last photograph of John Lennon and Yoko Ono before he was shot, and was the cover of Rolling Stone. Muhammad Ali at his mansion before he passed away. William Wegman and his dog, Fay Ray. You know those photographs you see of a dog all dressed up and looking a little forlorn? He's a fine artist and he does those shots. Jessie Norma, singer, I think. Beth Henley is a writer. Lily Tomlin is a comedian. I don't know what David Byrne actually does. Keith Haring is a performance artist. Whoopi Goldberg, and I don't know how many gallons of whole milk in a bathtub. That's an ingenious shot. John Cleese. I don't even know how they did. Not sure how they even did that. Isabella Rossellini and David Lynch from the movie Blue Velvet. Patti Smith. Patti Smith is a performer, and it is said that she and I can't remember his name now, for a year decided that they would go make themselves, for 1 year in New York, they would go to every art event and make their names inseparable with art in New York City. Sissy Spacek. Sting, this is just north of LA, there's a dry lake bed up there. Steve Martin, in a white tuxedo. And Queen Elizabeth II of England. That is Annie Leibovitz on location with her equipment. She shoots on location. She takes everything with her. Steve McCurry. Steve McCurry is the guy who photographed it. Okay, this is a 14-year-old soldier. And this is a guy working in the cutting steel in India. This is an Indian tradition where they use colored dust and spread it up as part of a holy day tradition. Tibet. Also Tibet. This is a red boy, and it's also from India. This is the shot that made him famous. This is the 14-year-old Afghani girl during the Afghan war. You've all seen this photograph. This is the photograph that made him famous. And that's Steve McCurry. Looks like another guy on the street. You could pass him and not even know. Let me put this away. And I'm going to stop sharing. So I'm assigning paper number 2 to look at the portraiture of the 20th century and compare it to the quality of portraiture of the 19th century. What does a portrait today in the 20th or 21st century say versus a 19th century portrait? And you can submit those papers through Canvas. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'll see you next time.